All right, our next presenter is Lara Aknin, excuse me, assistant professor in the Department of Psychology.
So hi, my name is Lara Aknin, and thank you for the introduction. I've prepared some slides, but I actually think there's quite a bit of overlap with Sarah, and so I'll use my time to the best. So I just want to say thanks for the honor of receiving this award. I really love teaching. I feel it's a big part of who I am. And in fact, one very short illustrative story of that is that when I found out I got my first TA job as a graduate student, I started immediately holding practice office hours for my brother who was just starting undergrad at our family's kitchen table. So I took the job very seriously from a very early stage, and I still really, really enjoy it. And in fact, I love teaching. I feel really lucky that I get to do it. I think the reason I love it so much is because I see it as a constant challenge to find connections between things that are important to me. And so I thought I would spend my time with you guys here today talking about the connections I try to draw in my teaching, and talking about which ones I try to foster, how I do so, and why in all of 9 minutes. And so we'll see how far we go. The first kind of connection I try to draw, and like the other two I'll talk about, it's something I see students really, in my opinion, kind of craving in the classroom, and this one is perhaps the most obvious, is really how the connections or the content that we're covering in class is relevant to them. And so I take it upon myself to try to draw as many explicit connections as I can. The first and foremost way I probably do this most often is providing as many as possible memorable but appropriate personal examples. So for instance, when we talk about schemas and how they're social scripts or scripts for understanding our social world, I give an example of how my cousin misremembered my proposal story with my partner. Specifically, he is a lawyer, and so she misremembered somehow that he asked me to sign a contract at our proposal, which was not true. But what happened was I was so flabbergasted by the whole thing when he got down on one knee and proposed, I simply nodded and he asked for clarification. And so I said, yeah, that means yes, and we all went on, and I didn't realize that was such a critical point in the story until I later heard a cousin retelling this to my great aunt who took it and ran with it. But essentially I overheard her saying that he asked for my signature, which was not true. And so I explained this to my students as an example of a schema gone awry. Essentially it hijacked the information, and she applied her knowledge of him as a lawyer and remembered this request for clarification, and essentially blended the material and took off with what is now a giant lie. And so in addition, I try to pull in as many pop culture references as possible. I try to show clips from Jimmy Kimmel and The Office and 30 Rock, which is now one of my favorite shows, but no longer on air, so maybe not as current as I like to imagine. But I think students really appreciate it because they get the opportunity to hear not just my examples, but see it from another point of view. But I think it also plays double duty in that students get to see that this is a relevant social phenomenon that's at play in other people's lives, not just my own. Whenever possible, I try to bring in demos and reenactments of classic or important studies because I think this helps students appreciate the methodology, but if and whenever possible, try to bring the phenomena to life. And so I find that's important because it's a lot more memorable when you yourself have experienced it. And along very similar lines, I really encourage students to find their own personal examples, not just live through my own weird ones. And so I encourage this throughout the semester repeatedly, and you'll see in other ways I do so. But I really actually have one assignment dedicated to this in my undergraduate class called a me-search paper, where I ask students to generate or to take one of their own personal examples and really come to explore it through the lens of a social psychology theory or phenomena that we've covered, and draw explicit connections and see if it fits and if it doesn't. And I think this really hammers home to students the relevance of the material, and as they're very quick to point out, I think the personal experiences and the examples help them digest the information up front, but then remember it later on. So the second kind of connection I try to build in the classroom is a connection between ideas. And this is, I think, just a search for greater coherence and meaning that happens everywhere, but I think especially in the classroom where students can feel a little overwhelmed at times. And so I try to address this question of how ideas fit together in several ways. The first and probably most obvious, but I think very helpful means is just by presenting an overview at the start of each class, mentioning what it is we'll be covering that day. It helps students see the content topics up ahead, but see what we're going to be covering in what order. But hopefully I try to point out that these ideas will be building in complexity over the course of the class. And then I revisit it several times to help students realize this is where we are on this roadmap, if you will. And I think it kind of grounds them in what might otherwise be big topics. Similar to finding coherence within one class, I try to offer students consistent course themes that are essentially threads that weave together all the topics we cover in classes that are in my introductory social psych class. It's essentially a survey of a whole bunch of topics, everything from love and attraction to aggression to happiness to attitudes and cognitive dissonance. It's a wide range of topics, but I note very early on, and it's labeled on my syllabus, that there are 2 course themes that really help pull everything together. And so I try to actually carve out a few minutes at the beginning lectures in this, or lessons in the semester, to kind of draw explicit connections between what we covered today and the course themes. And then I encourage students to try to draw those explicit connections later on in the course as kind of a quiz to themselves. And finally, one thing that I have found very helpful in it, like the mid-course feedback you were talking about, is these lecture comprehension checks that I do at the end of each class. I dedicate the last 3 to 5 minutes of every class to ask students to just rip off a scrap piece of paper and jot down their take-home message. And then I go to my office and read them after class or on the bus and look like a crazy person with scraps of paper all over my lap. But it's really great and helpful for me because it helps me see if the material came across as I intended. And if not, I can address it at the start of next class and clear up any points of confusion. But if it was on point and students seem to get the message, it's a great opportunity for me to feed back their understanding and use that as a springboard to that day's topic and help draw connections. All right, the final connection I try to facilitate, or at least at a higher order concept, is really this connection between people. And this is probably my favorite because I think it helps students see how they're connected to one another, how they're connected to me, and hopefully the larger field and discipline. And so I try to do this at all those various stages. I try to connect students in the classroom with many opportunities for class discussion. So for instance, just a few weeks ago, we were talking about attitudes and self-serving attributions. So it's the tendency for us to take credit when we do something well, but blame failures on external sources. And after a couple examples of my own, I asked the students to turn to their neighbors and talk about how this might play out at the exam if they do well or poorly. Students have fun with that. And actually, new this year, I'm trying a 2-stage test, which I've only read about, and I've done some heavy reading now. But essentially, it's an exam like you would normally have. Students complete the first part of the test on their own independently. Then I collect all the materials and then ask them to do it again in small groups of 3 to 5 people. They do the exact same exam in groups. Now, apparently research suggests that these exams are a lot less stressful for students. In fact, some people report that they actually enjoy exams, but it apparently also increases learning and that performance goes up and retention, long-term retention goes up. I have yet to try this. The exam is actually tomorrow morning, so I can report back to you on how it goes. But the reason I bring this up and what I think is really fascinating is that I've had several students actually spontaneously mention, without being prompted, that they're looking forward to the midterm, which is something I've never had happen before. So we'll see how it goes tomorrow, but I think it's because they intuit this sense of social support and from one another. To connect, to foster some kind of connection with myself and students, I try to be as approachable as possible, both in terms of time and personality. So I offer what's called invitational office hours, which is once over the semester I invite each student in groups of 20 at a time to come meet me for coffee on campus. Not everybody shows up, and that's probably for the best because it would be hard to have a meaningful conversation with 20 people at once. But for the 5 or so that do show up, we get to have a great chat about recent course material and upcoming assignment, stuff that's happening, how to apply to grad school, and those who show up seem to really appreciate it. Also, as mentioned earlier, I try to offer lots of personal examples because I think the students want to learn about who we are, and I actually literally see them lean forward in their seats when we give personal examples, and so I find minds kind of gravitate toward those stories, and that seems to work well. And finally, I try to foster some sense of some kind of connection between students in the field. Now, my favorite way of doing so far is in my undergrad class, where I assign a paper for students to read. It's from a top peer-reviewed journal in our field. It's short, it's recent, it's supposed to be like a sexy article that they all really enjoy reading. I ask them to extract the key methods and results, map it to the course themes, and then I ask them to pose one question for the author. Unbeknownst to students, I've selected a paper that was written by a friend of mine, and so the day the assignment is due, I either bring this person to class or Skype them in, and they get to interview the author with their pre-prepared questions. And students often really like this because they don't get the opportunity to interact with researchers other than their faculty members from other institutions. And so, and often these friends of mine are young and of mixed backgrounds, and so students get to see that these researchers look a lot like themselves, not necessarily the stereotypes we might see in older, outdated textbooks. So that's pretty much it, just a blank slide to say that I mentioned at the beginning teaching is a really big part of how I see myself, but so is my research. And I actually see these really, like no pun intended, or multiple layers of complexity here, but it's really nice to see all this connection between my teaching and research, because I actually research the importance of social connections and generosity for well-being, and so I find it very fitting, no pun intended also, that all of these connections kind of come together. So thank you.